There are some things a man says without thinking. A throwaway line tossed into the cold morning air that follow him for the rest of his life. Not because they were cruel, not because they were wrong, but because the woman they were aimed at had the kind of quiet composure that made a man realize, mid-sentence, that he had said something much more significant than he intended. Callum Bryce was 52 years old when he said the thing he could never take back. And the strange truth of it was, he never wanted to. The town of Moose Creek, Alberta, sits at the edge of a spruce forest that doesn't care what season you think it is. In October, it snows. In May, it sometimes snows again. Just to remind you, the people who stayed in Moose Creek, and staying was always a choice, never an accident, had a particular quality about them. They were patient in a way that city people sometimes mistook for slowness. They weren't slow. They were simply accustomed to waiting for the right moment, the way you wait for ground that's thawed enough to plant. Callum Bryce had lived in Moose Creek for 23 years by the time Harriet Fenn arrived. He was 52, with a face that had been rained on and sunned on in roughly equal measure, and hands that told the story of every fence post he had ever driven into frozen ground. He ran a timber operation on the north side of the valley, nothing enormous. Just enough to keep 4 men employed and the lights on in his own house, a low, wide-roofed 3 summers. Over the course of 3 summers and 2 very long winters, he was not, by any measure of the word, a man looking for company. Harriet Fenn was 27 years old when she came to Moose Creek to take over her late uncle's surveying business. She arrived on a Tuesday in late September with 2 suitcases, a drafting table disassembled in the back of a borrowed truck, and an expression that said she had already thought through every objection you might raise and found them insufficient. She was not, by any measure of the word, a woman who needed permission to be somewhere. The first time Callum saw her, she was standing at the edge of his timber property with a tripod, a theodolite, and a notebook, making marks in the kind of deliberate handwriting that suggested she had learned it from someone who believed penmanship was a moral matter. He pulled his truck over. "That's private land," he said, through the rolled-down window. "I know," she said, without looking up. "I'm surveying the boundary, not trespassing on it. There's a difference." The boundary marker's 20 feet to the east. She looked up then. She had brown eyes and an expression that was not unfriendly, exactly, but that communicated a precise tolerance for being told things she already knew. "The boundary marker," she said, "is in the wrong place. Your grandfather drove it in 1961. The original land title puts the line here." She tapped her notebook. "I can show you." Callum got out of the truck. He would later tell his friend Walt, who was the kind of friend who listened carefully and said very little, that he had gotten out of the truck because he genuinely wanted to look at her records. And that was true. It was also true that something about the way she said your grandfather made him feel, for a reason he could not immediately explain, like paying attention. Her records were meticulous. The boundary marker was, in fact, in the wrong place, and had been for 63 years. This meant that a strip of land 8 feet wide and roughly 200 feet long along the north fence line was technically not his, but belonged to the parcel his neighbor had sold the previous spring, which Harriet Fenn's uncle had been hired to survey before he died, and which she had now inherited the contract to complete. 8 feet, Callum said. 8 feet, she agreed. Doesn't change much. No, she said, but it's still 8 feet. He stood there for a moment in the October cold, looking at the spruce line and the gray sky above it, and then at the young woman with her theodolite and her correct boundary lines, and he said, "Do you want coffee?" She looked at him. "Is your coffee good?" "No," he said honestly. "Then yes," she said. "I'll have some." Not with a rescue. Not with a dramatic moment. With bad coffee and a property line that had been wrong for 63 years, and a woman who did not pretend the coffee was better than it was. She came back 3 more times that week for legitimate surveying reasons, and each time she came back she accepted a cup of bad coffee, and they stood at his kitchen counter and talked about whatever was immediately in front of them. The weather, the angle of the spruce trees, a moose that had been walking across his lower field every morning at 7 o'clock, with an expression of complete indifference to the world's opinion of her. "She knows she owns the place," Harriet said, watching the moose through the kitchen window on a Thursday morning. "She does own the place," Callum said. "She was here before the fence." "I like that logic," Harriet said. "It has the advantage of being true," he said. He was not, at 52, a man who talked easily. He had been married once, briefly, in his late 30s, to a woman named Sharon who had been kind and sensible and who had eventually and quite reasonably concluded that she did not want to spend her life in a town where winter lasted 6 months, and the nearest movie theater was an hour's drive. He did not blame Sharon. He understood the arithmetic of that decision completely. And he had not, in the 14 years since, found anyone whose company made him want to revisit the question. He was not looking, he told himself. He was not the kind of man who looked. What he was, without quite realizing it, was a man who had started looking forward to the sound of a particular truck in his driveway. The surveying job was finished in 2.5 weeks. Harriet submitted her report to the county office, corrected the boundary marker with a new post and 2 witnesses present, one of whom was Callum, the other a bored county clerk who signed the paperwork and went home for lunch, and technically had no remaining professional reason to be on or near Callum Bryce's property. She came back on a Saturday, not for surveying reasons. She arrived with a pot of coffee, real coffee from the good place in town, and a question. "Do you actually know where the boundary runs on the west side of your south field?" she asked. "Because I was looking at the original land title again, and there's something strange about the 1947 survey notation." Callum took the coffee. He poured 2 cups. He handed one back to her. "I know where I think it runs," he said. "That's not the same thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." They spent that Saturday afternoon walking the south field. The something strange in the 1947 survey notation turned out to be a surveyor's error that had been quietly perpetuated for 79 years and would require a formal correction to the title. This was, objectively, a minor administrative matter that could have been handled by correspondence and did not require 2 people walking the full perimeter of a field in November. They walked the full perimeter of the field in November. By the time they got back to the house, the light had gone gray and thin, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees, and Callum made soup from whatever was in the refrigerator. And Harriet sat at his kitchen table and worked on her notes, and neither of them thought there was anything unusual about this arrangement. "Friends, I want to stop here for just a moment, because there's something I want to say directly to you. You know how it is when you can see exactly where 2 people are heading, and somehow they can't see it themselves? Not because they're foolish, but because they've each, in their own private way, decided that this particular thing is probably not for them. I've seen it more times than I can count, and I find it equal parts maddening and endearing. But before I go any further, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. If you're here from Ontario, or British Columbia, or Manitoba, or anywhere else in this great country, or if you found your way here from somewhere else entirely, leave a comment and say hello. And if this story is finding something in you, a like means the world to us here at Frontier Roots. It's the thing that keeps these stories coming. Now, back to Callum and Harriet. The winter in Moose Creek that year started early and meant it. By mid-November, the ground was frozen solid, and the spruce trees wore snow on their branches, the way old men wear hats, permanently, without much ceremony. Callum's timber operation slowed in deep winter, the way it always did. He spent the cold months doing maintenance work, sharpening equipment, going over accounts, and occasionally driving the hour to Edmonton for supplies or to visit his sister's family. He was used to the quiet. He had, in fact, organized his life around the quiet, in a way he had never examined very carefully, because examining it would have required admitting how much of the organization was intentional. He found himself noticing, that November, that his mornings had gotten longer. Not longer in minutes. The same number of minutes as always. Longer in the way that a room becomes larger when something that was filling it is no longer there. The 1947 survey correction was filed in early December. Harriet's work on the Valley parcel was, by any reasonable professional definition, complete. She stopped coming by. This was, of course, entirely reasonable. She had a business to run. Other contracts. She had not been coming by for personal reasons, or at least she had not said so in any explicit terms, and Callum was not a man who read into things that had not been said explicitly. Or so he had always believed. He lasted 9 days. On the 10th day, he drove to the office of Fenn Surveying, which occupied the lower floor of a narrow brick building on the main street of Moose Creek, next to a hardware store, and across from a diner where Callum had eaten every Tuesday lunch for 20 years. He had driven past this building twice a day, every day, for 9 days, without stopping. On the 10th day, he stopped. He told himself he was there about the South Field boundary correction, a follow-up, question about the filing, which was true in the way that technically accurate statements can sometimes be true without being the whole truth. Harriet was at her drafting table when he came in. She had a pencil behind each ear, one she was currently using, one in reserve, and a blueprint spread out under a weighted ruler. She looked up when the bell over the door rang. "Mr. Bryce," she said, they had, at some point during the Southfield afternoon, moved to first names. Her using his last name was, he understood immediately, a message, though he was not entirely sure what message. "Callum," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Callum," she agreed. "I had a question about the Southfield filing. It's filed correctly." "Right," he said. He stood there. "Good." There was a pause that lasted approximately 4 seconds and felt considerably longer. "Was there anything else?" she asked. He looked around the office. It was orderly in the same way her notebooks were orderly. Everything with a purpose and a place, nothing wasted, nothing decorative except for a single small photograph pinned to the wall beside the drafting table. 2 people standing in front of what looked like a survey marker in a field somewhere, squinting into the sun. "Who's he?" "Who's that?" he asked. "My uncle and my father," she said, "about 15 years ago. Before my uncle got sick, they look like they're arguing about something. They were arguing about whether that survey marker was in the right place. They were brothers. They argued about everything for 40 years and still went fishing together every spring." She paused. "The marker was in the wrong place for what it's worth. My father was right. He always was when it came to boundary lines." Callum looked at the photograph for a moment longer. Then he said, "Have you eaten lunch?" She looked at him. "It's 11 in the morning. Early lunch." The pause this time was shorter. "The diner across the street is adequate," she said. "It's been adequate for 20 years," he said. "That's either an endorsement or a warning." "Both," he said honestly. She capped her pen. They had lunch at the diner across the street, and then they had lunch there again the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. And then, without any formal discussion about it, it became a standing arrangement that had nothing to do with surveying and everything to do with the fact that Callum Bryce, at 52 years old, had apparently not finished being surprised by life. He told Walt about it in January, standing in Walt's barn while Walt sharpened a saw blade. "She's 27, Callum said. "I know," Walt said. "You've mentioned it. That's 25 years. The arithmetic's not the issue," Walt said. "Then what is?" Walt set down the blade and looked at him. "What are you actually asking me, Callum?" Callum was quiet for a moment. The barn smelled of hay and cold metal and the particular kind of silence that old friends are comfortable inside. "Nothing," he said finally. "Never mind." Said Walt. Harriet, for her part, was not unaware of the arithmetic. She was 27 years old, and she had been surveying boundary lines for 5 years, and she had a highly developed sense of where things actually were, as opposed to where people assumed them to be. She also had a highly developed sense of when a man was standing in a doorway without quite coming in. She didn't push. She wasn't built for pushing. What she was built for was patience of the particular kind that waits not passively but alert. The way you wait for conditions to shift when you know they will shift, you simply don't know when. She had a conversation with her friend Meredith, another transplant to Moose Creek, a potter who had arrived from Vancouver 10 years ago for a residency and never left, in early February at Meredith's kitchen table over tea that was much better than Callum's coffee. "He's 52, Meredith said. "I'm aware," Harriet said. "Is that, Meredith?" "I'm just asking." "No," Harriet said. "It isn't." She drank her tea. Outside, the February wind moved through the spruce trees in that low, sustained way it had, like the sound of something very large breathing. "He's careful," Harriet said. "He thinks a lot before he says things." "That's not a bad quality," Meredith said. "It's not," Harriet agreed, "but sometimes I wish he'd think just a little bit faster." The thing that broke the careful, measured, exquisitely patient arrangement open was, in the end, a fence post. It was March. The ground was still frozen, but there was a quality to the afternoon light that suggested it was at least thinking about spring, even if it wasn't ready to commit. Callum had discovered on his north property line that a section of fence that had been standing since his grandfather's time had finally given up and lay in pieces across the snow, which meant that 3 of his neighbor's cattle had spent the previous night in his lower field and eaten a quantity of hay he had not planned to share. He was examining the situation, crouched down, looking at a fence post that had rotted through at the base, when he heard a truck on the road and looked up to find Harriet pulling over. She got out. She was carrying a coffee thermos and she had on the green wool jacket she wore for outdoor work. She walked over and looked at the fence. "Post rot," she said. "Post rot," he agreed. "Your grandfather put these in." "He did." She looked along the fence line. "How long is this section?" "About 300 feet. She said. She opened the thermos and poured 2 cups with the focused efficiency of a person who does not spill things and handed him one. He took it. He looked at the fence. He looked at her. "You don't have to help," he said. "I know," she said, and then, after a brief pause, "But I'm going to." They drove together to the hardware store and came back with new posts and post hole equipment and spent the afternoon replacing 6 fence posts in the March cold. Harriet worked with the same precise, methodical energy she applied to everything. She measured the spacing, she didn't take shortcuts, and when Callum set one post slightly off vertical, she pointed it out, and they reset it without any drama, which was the only way it would have occurred to either of them to handle the matter. By the time they finished, the light was going, and they were both cold in the specific way you get cold when you've been working outside in sub-temperatures. Not the cold of standing still, but the deeper cold that gets in past the work, settles into your bones without your noticing until you stop. They stood at the tailgate of his truck, looking at the repaired fence line. "Good posts?" "Cedar," Callum said. "Nothing else holds in this ground. Your grandfather used spruce." "My grandfather was wrong about fence posts," Callum said, "and about boundary markers." "He was thorough, though," Harriet said. "He set a lot of them." "He did," Callum agreed. "In all the wrong places." They stood there in the late afternoon light. The cold was real now, specific and settled. The fixed fence stretched away along the north property line, 6 new cedar posts pale against the older gray ones. "Harriet," Callum said. She said. "At this rate," he said, "you're going to end up knowing this property better than I do." She looked at him. There was something in her expression that he would spend years trying to describe precisely and never quite manage. Not amusement exactly, not exasperation. Something more complex and more patient than either. "At this rate," she said, "that might take a while. You'd have to keep coming back," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at the fence line for a moment. Then he said, "You've been correcting everything on this property since September." The property needed correcting. The fence posts needed correcting, he said. The boundary marker needed correcting. He paused. "I'm starting to think you might be correcting me as well." She tilted her head slightly. "Are you complaining?" He thought about it. He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to every question that actually mattered. "No," he said. She nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already worked out. Then she screwed the cap back onto the thermos and walked to her truck. At her door, she stopped and looked back at him. "Callum," she said. "Yes, ask me." He stood very still. The February wind, March wind now, just barely, moved through the spruce trees. The new fence post stood pale and straight against the darkening sky. "Ask you what?" he said, though he knew. She looked at him for a long moment. "You're a careful man," she said. "You measure twice, you use cedar, you reset a post when it's off by 2 degrees. She held his gaze. "Stop measuring. Ask me." Then she got in her truck and drove down the road. He did ask her. He asked her the following Saturday morning, at her office, because he was not a man who could do it across a diner table with the Tuesday regulars nearby, and because he thought she deserved the consideration of something deliberate rather than something grabbed at in a moment of cold and failing light. He brought coffee, good coffee, from the place she always got it from. He had figured out by then where she bought it. He told her the arithmetic because he thought she deserved to hear him say it plainly and not pretend it wasn't real. 25 years. The gap between them was a full-grown adult. He told her that he wasn't sure he'd be interesting enough for her in 10 years, or young enough in 20, and that there were things he could give her and things he genuinely couldn't, and he didn't want her to find out about the second category after it was too late to matter. She let him finish. She was very good at letting people finish. Then she said, "Callum, I survey land for a living. I do not work from assumptions. I work from measurements." "I know," he said. "I have been measuring since September," she said. "I've had all winter." She looked at him steadily. "I know where the line is. I know what's on either side of it. I'm not asking you to give me things you can't give me. I'm asking you, and I've been asking you since December in the only language you seem to be comfortable with, to stop standing at the boundary and come to where I am." He was quiet. "You said your grandfather set markers in all the wrong places," she said. "He did. You corrected them." "We did," he said. "Together," she nodded. "Well then." He looked at her. She looked back. "The certificate on the wall," said Fenn, surveying. The photograph of her uncle and her father showed 2 men who had argued for 40 years and still gone fishing every spring. "Harriet Fenn," he said. "Would you?" "Yes," she said. "I hadn't finished." "I know," she said. "Yes." They were married in June on a clear Saturday at the edge of the spruce forest, with Walt as a witness and Meredith as another, and Harriet's father, who had driven from Saskatoon, standing with an expression that Callum could not quite read and eventually decided was the look of a man who was assessing whether someone was actually where he said he was. After the ceremony, Harriet's father shook Callum's hand and said, with the directness of a man who had spent his life reading land, "She knows what she's doing." "I know," Callum said. "Good," said her father. And that was the extent of it. That was 31 years ago. Callum is 83 now, and Harriet is 58, and they still live in the low, wide-roofed house he built himself in the valley. The timber operation was sold 12 years ago to 2 of the men who had worked for him, which he considers the right outcome. Harriet still surveys, less now than she used to, and mostly for the county, historic property work, boundary corrections that have been sitting uncorrected since the 1940s or earlier, which suits her precise and patient nature exactly. They have 2 children. Both have moved to other cities, which is fine. They come back at Christmas, when the spruce forest wears its snow the way old men wear hats, and the kitchen smells of whatever Callum has decided to make, and the moose, a different moose now, decades removed from the original, but with the same expression of complete indifference, still crosses the lower field some mornings at around 7 o'clock. Harriet still drinks her coffee from the good place in town. Callum learned, at some point in the early years, to buy the right kind. I heard about them from a man who used to work in the county records office. The same clerk, as it happens, who had witnessed the boundary marker correction back in October of that first year. He told me about them the way you tell stories about people who seem to have found something most people spend their lives looking for and not finding. Not without difficulty, he said, not without the ordinary complications and frustrations of 2 people who are genuinely different trying to build something together. But with a kind of basic commitment to accuracy, to measuring honestly, correcting what was wrong, and not pretending a fence post was vertical when it was off by 2 degrees. They still argue, he said. About what? I asked. About everything, he said, and he was smiling when he said it. There are some things a man says without thinking. And the remarkable thing, the thing that takes a lifetime to understand, is that sometimes the thing you say without thinking is more honest than anything you could have prepared. Callum didn't plan to give Harriet an opening. He just spoke plainly the way men like him speak, and she was paying close enough attention to hear what was underneath it. That's the thing about people who spend their lives measuring carefully. They hear the line even when no one's announced where it is. May God bless you and everyone you love. If you're here from somewhere in this country, or from across the world, and this story found something in you, leave a comment and let us know. Every word you leave behind means more than you know. And until next time, friends, keep your posts cedar, keep your lines true, and keep riding.